Thank you for coming. This is going to be a very interesting panel. As Jane said, it's emerging markets, blockchain and digital innovation. Something that's very dear to my heart in the emerging markets. You've got a very interesting group. There's three of us, but I promise you we won't be boring. I do policy and regulation in the emerging world. I have an incubator on the left of me, and I have an infrastructure builder on the right of me. So before we get going, I'm going to let them just introduce yourself, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work, and then we'll get into a bit into the nitty-gritty of the topic in 20 minutes.
Hi, my name is John Kamara. I am the founder for Ada Labs in Kenya. We are a smart technology-driven lab focused around social impact projects with commercial viability underpinned by blockchain solutions. And we focus on consumer mass products within the economies that we work with, agri-tech, fintech, lifestyle, education technology. And the idea for blockchain for us is a multi-layer approach where we first use blockchain for solution development, transparency, security, and then once we've created a community, then we start looking at tokenization. So we actually have real usability for the token projects that we do rather than the other way around.
Okay, I've got, Charles, I think you're mic'd up. So.
I think I'm mic'd up. Yes, hello, I'm Charles Cunningham. I run the Tabba project. The Tabba project is concerned with blockchain as infrastructure. What that means in practice is getting a blockchain that delivers massive transactional throughput. One of the big challenges of blockchain systems, especially public consensus blockchains, is that they have very low transactional throughput rates. Bitcoin does a massive 5 transactions a second, and Ethereum does an even more massive 12 transactions a second. And our approach is to parallelize the consensus algorithm, which allows us to scale linearly. The more processing power you put in, the more throughput you can get, to millions of transactions a second, although we haven't achieved that. We're up to tens of thousands in our labs. My concern with the emerging markets is that a lot of the nations that are emerging, still emerging, are emerging because of government failure, basically. And I'm interested in seeing how and using blockchain to ameliorate some of those government failures. An example of this is that the World Bank estimates, for example, that Western aid to the developing world amounts to about $150 billion a year, of which 3/4 of it goes, or more than 3/4 of it goes direct to governments. But the World Bank also estimates that 1/4 of that money going to governments is stolen by people in government. So blockchain could help with that problem. That's as an example.
Being the moderator, my name is Loretta Joseph. The emerging markets is very dear to my heart. I moved to India with a kid on my own in 2005, one of the largest emerging markets in the world. And in 2010, I'm going to tell you a story about why I decided that technology was very important. So I had a number of people working for me in my house. I was running RBS, a large bank. One of my workers had 11 children. She lived in the slums. Her 13-year-old, who was the middle of them, had to go to work at 13 because they couldn't afford to educate her. Her first day at work, she got raped and murdered by 20 guys. They burnt the body. She had no ID. I couldn't stand up for this kid. I had to bury her. She looked after my little girl. And I remember thinking back in 2010, how does this happen? How does the world happen like this? There has to be a better way. So I got into looking at how we could solve some of the problems of things like ID. So when I discovered blockchain in 2013, I was also a banker. I looked at it not only from the way that we could disintermediate financial markets, immutable, transparent, secure databases, but also how we can now use cases to help some of the fundamental problems that are in the emerging world. So we're an interesting panel. I write policy. I don't know if some of you listened to me yesterday. I wrote the first legislation on digital assets in Bermuda. I consequently work across Africa. I work across Nigeria, Kenya, a number of other African countries. Yesterday there was a landmark decision in India to not ban Bitcoin from the Supreme Court, the biggest democracy on the planet. So I think looking at where digital innovation goes, that was very, very powerful. I sit in Mauritius, which is a tiny little island in the Indian Ocean. But Mauritius opens up and is the gateway to both Africa and India. So I believe if policy and regulations are aligned, we can help this emerging world. And the emerging world is where blockchain and digital innovation actually have the most impact, because everybody has access to a telephone. I think the internet changed everything, and in the emerging world, the access to to digital innovation through a telephone is incredibly powerful. It's probably the most powerful thing that we've seen in our lifetimes, and it will continue to, because technology goes across wealth, education, and everybody has access to it. So digital innovation will come, I think, first from the emerging world, because they don't have the legacy systems. It's very hard for me to write policy and change laws in Australia, in the UK, in the US and Europe, because the legacy system is very difficult. But when you're sitting in emerging markets where you have real problems, most people don't have identifications, there's no financial inclusion, sleuth of problems. Technology can leapfrog, and I think India was a perfect example of this, because when I lived there, India, I don't know if anyone's dealt with the Indian government, but they don't answer you on an email ever. Now the reason that happened was because nobody in any government office had a computer. But the minute the mobile device came in, everybody jumped straight to WhatsApp. Everybody in India will answer you within 30 seconds on a WhatsApp, but they'll never answer you on an email. I was in Madagascar 2 weeks ago. Madagascar is the poorest place in Africa. It has the lowest GDP. It's the highest resource-rich country in Africa, 4th biggest country in the world. 90% of the people live under the poverty line. 95% people have access to a 4G mobile phone. So you look at what the impact of things like blockchain and digital innovation can do in these places. In a country like in the UK, in Britain and in Australia, where 95% of your population are banked, are we going to move fast? Probably not. But when you're looking at some of the other countries in the emerging world where 90 to 95% of the people are not banked, this actually changes economic and social means. So I'm really keen to hear about what you're doing with the entrepreneurs, because the people that are leading this in the emerging world are the young kids. You look at Africa and India, youngest populations in the world, but they also have the hugest customer markets for all of you. We can test markets in these worlds as long as policy and regulation is good, and we're training entrepreneurs to build systems which they need to build for their countries.
I think I grew up in Ireland, so Ireland and London for years before moving back 4 years ago. One of the things that I learned very quickly was the fact that the mass economy market in these emerging communities are ready-made and ripe to innovate very quickly. And the people who drive that innovation are the young people. So we decided to start this lab and specifically focus on mass economy products, and be able to then see how, first of all, do we use blockchain to help these entrepreneurs to create a more transparent product, because one of the things that we also struggle with a lot of, we have so much data we're collecting, huge amounts of data. I mean, we build platforms and within a year we have 1 million customers or 2 million customers, which you can't get in the UK or in Ireland. It takes forever. Our cost per acquisition is sometimes as low as 10 cents. So it's a haven for investors. But so first of all, you look at that, then also you look at transparency, who's handling this data. There's young kids as well who are handling this huge amount of data. They build an application, they build a platform. The next day, they have 500,000 customers who are transacting on a payment platform. So we can underpin it using blockchain technology. And then when we look at some of the problems that we want to solve across the ecosystem, so I'll take a specific example of one of the companies in our lab called Ecoba. So one of the key drivers for economies in most African countries is women. And in those women, we go to what we call savings groups. So these women have been existing, same thing in India or any emerging market, for years, saving informally among themselves to borrow themselves. so that they can survive in the market. And we're talking about millions of women. I mean, this company, they have access to almost 8 million women in one go, just in one country. One country, 8 million women they are going to be talking to. But the savings group is also a functional bank offline, and is also a functional lending association at the same time, but is also a functional economy at the same time. So what we've decided to do with them is, how do you digitize these people, first of all, by using blockchain to provide a lot of transparency and a lot of security around the digitization, because they all have 4G phones, these women, all of them. I was in the Masai Mara, and I could use my WhatsApp. So that's how connected it really is in the Mara, which there's nothing. So now you digitize these women. What the Scoba guys did, after they digitize the women, then these women are already saving. So each woman saves about $30 a month. So they save $30 a month, each one of them, group of 30 people, then they borrow themselves the money. So that's how they survive in business. Then you have other groups who are much more, even women who have proper jobs and who are a little more technology savvy, save a lot more money. But within this whole ecosystem, they're always looking to find how they borrow money outside, because they never felt they had enough money. But what Ecowa, the entrepreneur, figured out was that if you actually bring this group together and they're transparent, they actually see they don't ever need to borrow money. They can actually borrow money amongst themselves at reduced interest rate within that actual functional groups. But it was because there was no visibility. And when she did an analysis within the group, every month they transact over $15 million. They just don't know it because they work in silos. So she came up with the idea, I'm going to digitize all these people, show them the value of themselves, give them transparency, then begin to look at the social enterprises that exist within the group. Now I'm going to tokenize that group. Because the user is a merchant, is a customer, and is also somebody who's looking to use. And then off the back of that, because it exists in multiple countries, I will then be able to use the same token to create intra-Africa trade. So the group in another country and the one in this country, they will willingly accept the token in that economy because it's one huge economy. So you have created usability for that, crypto token project out of need and necessity, rather than just creating a great ICO because it sounds good. But there is real usability on day one, because those merchants on the streets will now ask you, how do you want me to pay? You say, pay with my Koba coin. And they will actually take it from you on your phone. You snap your phone, I snap my phone, the Koba coin goes from my phone to your phone, and then that's it. That's it. And it's all recorded on the blockchain in a public ledger within that ecosystem. So that is what she's building, and we're incubating her. And I think at the moment they already have signed contracts with almost 500,000 of those groups to test. They've just started. We have another platform, which is Dukare. In 6 months, they've transacted 23 billion shillings worth of transactions, in the retail FMCG space. But again, trying to then tokenize that economy and create value within that economy for the consumers so that they can process money quicker and faster, because processing Kenyan shillings against dollars, against this for those retailers is quite a complex scenario, because the central banks. And so again, using that smart token within that economy, they can cross-save money very, very quickly as they're actually processing for all the FMCGs and all the retail manufacturers. And I think last month, they hit 25 billion shillings worth of transactions. They're 6 months old. They have 42,000 retailers on their platform in 6 months. So to acquire these people, because everybody is now going into that, fourth industrial revolution that we're talking about, driven by the mobile phone. The most important thing that's happened in Africa is the mobile phone. And once you understand that the world revolves around that phone, then everything you provide, which is why we see Binance and all these platforms now coming into Africa to begin to look at specific African token economies. And for me, the key objective is to not just saying, I want to run, at least in Africa, I want to run ICO because there's some really cool stuff I want to do. No. What is the real problem that we're trying to solve? And let us first of all solve that problem on a digital landscape. And once we're able to do that, and we create a proof of value and a proof of use within, you have enough community within that community, and that's how M-Pesa started. Yeah. The last example I'll give you is a brand called OPay in Nigeria. So they basically have their application on the phone, OPay. And what they did, they started giving, we have what we call Okada drivers, borders. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that before. It's motorcycle drivers. You get on them and they transport you from one place to the other. So it's like your black cab, but it's motorcycles.
A bit scary.
Yeah, a bit scary, but there's thousands and hundreds and thousands of them. So they went to these guys and they basically said, hey, look, we will take every motorcycle ride. It's a mobility platform they started off with. Every motorcycle ride, we will pay you 5% if you get the consumer to pay with the OPay app. So the motorcycle driver is an acquirer. There's like 100,000 of them. And he's happy. 5% is probably like 30 cents, but to him it's a shitload of money. Okay, so he's like happy. So he goes to you when you get on the ride and he says, hey, look, you need to pay me via OPay. I don't accept anything else because I'm getting 5% on top of this ride. Then after that, he says to you, you also get 10% discount if you pay me. So you also download the app, and then you now ask him, how do I fund the app? He said, give me your money. I will actually fund it for you. So he funds your app for you at the same time. So now you're fully funded. Then you integrate your bank and everything. Now you use your OPay app. Then they pay you an interest rate of 5% per month on every money you leave deposited in their application. But they're getting the 17% from the bank. Sorry, real quick. But the objective is that they've basically built an economy, and now they're tokenizing an economy of 4.6 million people. Buying a token, the O token, is the only thing you can use. Their ICO is probably going to be one of the largest you've ever seen because the economy is already created. The economy trusts each other, and they're willing to accept the token in that economy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I spent a lot of time with the man that built the M-Pesa. I spent a lot of time in Kenya, and to me that's one of the best use cases that we saw came out of digital innovation in someone like Africa. And he was telling me about the last mile, getting that money into the people. Before we had blockchain was a very interesting use case. But getting to your point, women are the people that save. Women are the ones that run households. Giving them the ability, I do a lot of work giving mobile top-ups. If people give their data, we can do it with blockchain that is secure now. Because women, once they have money and you can start to financially make them literate, the first thing they do is educate their children. Their children have access to mobile phones. So if you give them the ability to use the internet, this whole wave of digital innovation in places like Africa and India is so powerful, because it takes people out of poverty. But we're going to move quickly on because we don't have much time left, but blockchain is not the be-all and end-all. I mean, I have to tell you that I think AI, the Internet of Things, and blockchain in these economies will merge together. Blockchain doesn't stand on its own. It's just one part of it. And we still have many problems. We talk about scalability, throughput, interoperability. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that, Charles, because it's very dear to your heart. But we are solving these problems. 6 years ago, I think we've come a long way. I think the biggest problem that I see in the community is that people come into these countries and goes, it's winner takes all. It's not. We all, across protocols, across each other, across governments, across policy, have to work together. I have this hashtag, collaboration is the new survival, because it's not winner takes all. Ethereum is not the killer protocol. Hyperledger is not the killer. But all of us together can work to make these protocols work better. Bitcoin doesn't scale. We've just had this conversation. Throughput's still an issue if you're looking at things like money transactions. We need scalability, social adoption, and you need institutions to buy into this. So just some quick thoughts on your infrastructure.
Okay. I got a mic.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the projects that have just been spoken about the usability consumer projects are all going to run into a big challenge when they reach full adoption, and that is that the platforms they run on won't be able to process the transactional throughput that they generate. And that's the challenge that we're addressing. So if you think about an economy running on a blockchain, replacing cash, how many transactions that involves. If you've got 1 million people and they will do a transaction a day, that's 1 million transactions a day. The current transactional throughput of cryptocurrency systems at the moment is about 300,000 a day for the world. So you can see there's a bit of an issue there. But it's an issue that we can address now. We've developed techniques for allowing blockchains to scale linearly with processing power. In the past, you used to put a load of processing power onto your blockchain system, and it'll become more secure. And the approach we've taken now allows us to put more processing power, and it will just scale by the amount of processing power you're adding in. And I think that's a really significant step forward. It's a bit like aeroplanes. The aeroplanes started off in 1903 with the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk moment. But it took until 1950 for the jet engine to be commercialized. And once we had jet engines, we could cross the Atlantic and fly. And that's basically the analogy I like to see with parallelization of the consensus mechanism. It allows us to have massively scalable blockchains to support your type of applications.
So I think we're now out of time. I think the emergence of this emerging technology and digital innovation, which I think we all have to say thank you to Robert Kahn, who built the internet for this, because 35 years ago we wouldn't have been talking about this. The digital innovation is much greater in the emerging world. I do believe myself that you need sensible regulation and policy. I don't believe that a bunch of technologists need to be wandering into Somalia and Uganda and telling the governments how to make regulation, because that doesn't work. There has to be sensible collaboration between policymakers, industry, and the governments. I think there needs to be a will from these emerging markets too to take out the corruption, because a lot of these places are still very corrupt. We have a lot of challenges, but technology is starting to solve it. So I hope we've given you a very broad range of the incubator, the policy, and the scalability and technology issues. It's been a pleasure to moderate the panel with you too. Thank you, Jane. And I hope you all have a really, really interesting day and get some great information out of the next panels.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a big hand.